Sunday afternoon, we are going to finish Hinds' Feet on High Places today. So, let's get started. Chapter 20, Return to the Valley. The place to which the King of Love now brought them was a most beautiful valley among the peaks of the high places. The whole of this sheltered spot was laid out in quiet gardens and orchards and vineyards. Here grew flowers of rarest beauty and lilies of every description. Here, too, were trees of spices and of many kinds of fruits, and nut trees, almonds and walnuts, and many other varieties which Grace and Glory had never seen before. Here the king's gardeners were always busy, pruning the trees, tending the plants and the vines, and preparing beds for new seedlings and tender shoots. These the king himself transplanted from uncongenial soil and condition in the valleys below, so that they might grow to perfection and bloom in that valley high above, ready to be planted in other parts of the kingdom of love, to beautify and adorn it where the king saw fit. They spent several delightful days watching the gardeners as they worked under the gracious supervision of the king himself, and accompanying him as he walked in the vineyards, teaching and advising those who tended the vines. One day, however, Grace and Glory with her two attendants walked to the end of the valley and found themselves on the very edge of the high places, from which they could look right down into the low places far below. As they stood there, they saw a long green valley between two chains of mountains, through which a river wound like a ribbon of light. Here and there were patches of brown and red, which seemed to be villages and dwelling places, surrounded with trees and gardens. All of a sudden Grace and Glory gave a queer little gasp, for she recognized the place. They were looking down into the valley of humiliation itself, the place where she had lived in misery for so long, and for which the shepherd had called her to the high places. Without a word, she sat down on the grassy slope, and as she looked, a multitude of thoughts filled her mind. Down there was the little white cottage where she had lived, and the pastures where the shepherds tended the king's flocks. There were the sheepfolds and the stream where the flocks went to drink, and where she had met the shepherd for the first time. In that valley were all her fellow workers, and the friends among whom she had lived, and with whom she had enjoyed such happy fellowship. Others she had known were there too. Away on the outskirts of the village was the cottage where her Aunt Dismal Forebodings lived, and where she had spent her miserable childhood with her cousins Gloomy and Spiteful and Craven Fear, as she thought of them and their wretched existence. A pang of compassion and pain shot through her heart. Poor Dismal, trying to hide the fact that her heart was broken by the unhappy marriages which her two daughters had made, and embittered by the shameful doings of her darling son. She saw the dwellings of her other relatives, the manor house, where decrepit old Lord Fearing lived, tortured by his failing powers and his dread of approaching death. There was the house where Pride lived, and near it the homes of bitterness and resentment. And under those dark trees lived miserable self-pity. She recognized the dwelling places of those who had so harassed her on her journey to the high places, and round about were the homes of other inhabitants of the valley, people who hated or despised or rejected the shepherd. As Grace and Glory sat looking down into the valley, the tears welled up in her eyes, and her heart throbbed with pain, two sensations which she had completely forgotten up there on the high places. Suddenly she discovered that her feelings toward her relatives and those who lived down there in the valley had undergone a complete change, and she saw them in a new light. She had thought of them only as horrible enemies, but now she realized that they were just miserable beings, such as she had been herself. They were indwelt and tormented by their different besetting sins and ugly natures, just as she had been by her fears. They were wretched slaves to the natures which gave them their names, and the more horrible the qualities which characterized them, the more misery they endured, and the more we should show them compassion. She could scarcely bear the thought, yet for so many years she had not only feared but also condemned them, had actually disdained their misery, telling herself it was their own fault. Yes, she, detestable, fear-enslaved, much afraid, had actually dared to disdain them for the things which made them so wretched and ugly, when she herself was equally wretched and enslaved. Instead of a fellow feeling of compassion and passionate desire that they might be delivered and transformed from the pride and resentment and bitterness which made them what they were, she had just detested and despised them. When she thought of that, she turned to Joy and Peace, who were sitting beside her, and cried out desperately, "Can nothing be done for them down there in the valley? Must my Aunt Dismal be left unhelped, and poor Spiteful and Gloomy too, and those cousins who went so far with us on the way to the high places, trying to turn us back? If the shepherd could deliver me, Grace and Glory, from all my fears and sins, couldn't he deliver them also from the things which do torment them?" "Yes," said Joy, who had been Sorrow. "If he can turn sorrow into joy, suffering into peace, and much afraid into grace and glory, how can we doubt that he could change pride and bitterness and resentment and self-pity too? And if they could but yield to him and follow him, and your Aunt Dismal could be changed into praise and thanksgiving, poor Gloomy and Spiteful also, we cannot doubt that it could be done, that they could be completely delivered from all the things which torment them." "But," cried Grace and Glory, "how can they be persuaded to follow the shepherd? At present they hate him and won't go near him." Then Peace, who had been suffering, said quietly, "I have noticed that when people are brought into sorrow and suffering, or loss, or humiliation, or grief, into some place of great need, they sometimes become ready to know the shepherd and to seek his help. We know, for example, that your Aunt Dismal is desperately unhappy over the behavior of poor Craven Fear, and it may be that she would be ready now to turn to the shepherd. Then poor Gloomy and Spiteful are so wretched that though they felt no need of the shepherd before, it is very possible that now is the time to try to persuade them to seek his help." "Yes," exclaimed Grace and Glory, "I am sure you are right." Oh, if only we could go to them! If only there was some way of helping them find what we have found!" At that very moment, close at hand, sounded the voice of the king. He came and sat down beside them, looked with them down into the valley so far below, and said gently to Grace and Glory, "Thou that dwellest in the gardens, the companions hearken to thy voice. Cause me to hear it." Song of Song 8:13. Grace and Glory turned to him and laid her hand upon his arm. "My lord," she said, "we were talking about the people who live down there in the Valley of Humiliation. They are my relatives, you know all of them. They are so wretched and miserable. What can we do for them, my lord? They don't know anything about the joy of the high places and the kingdom of love. There is my poor Aunt Dismal forebodings. I lived with her for a long time, and know that she is utterly wretched." "I know her," said the king quietly. "She is a most unhappy woman." "And her daughter Gloomy," went on Grace and Glory, looking at him entreatingly as she spoke. "She married Coward, the son of Lord Fearing, very rich, but much older than herself, and a miserably unhappy and selfish creature. I believe she has not known a moment's peace since. There was talk in the valley before I came away that he was likely to desert her." "He has done so," answered the king quietly, "and she has returned to her mother in the cottage, a miserable and disillusioned woman with a broken heart." "And her sister Spiteful? Poor, poor soul, with her sharp tongue, which makes so many enemies and deprives her of friends. She married Timid Skulking, and they are desperately poor, and have to live in one little rented room in the house of my cousin Bitterness and his wife. I cannot bear to think of their wretched condition while I live up here in the kingdom of love." "They are wretched indeed," said the king, even more gently and compassionately than before. "They have just lost the little daughter, who poor Spiteful had hoped would be such a comfort to them in their dreary circumstances." "And then," continued Grace and Glory, with just a hint of hesitation in her voice, "there is their brother Craven Fear." She did not look at the king as she spoke, but paused a moment, then went on hurriedly. "He is the most unhappy member of the whole family. He has broken his mother's heart. Neither of his sisters will speak to him any more, and he goes skulking about the valley, hated by everyone." "I know him," replied the king gravely, but with just a hint of a smile. "I know him well. You do not exaggerate when you speak of his wretchedness. I have had to interfere and chastise him many times to try and correct his bullying propensities. But though I have chastened him sore, I have not given him over to death." "No, no," cried Grace and Glory imploringly. "Don't ever do that, my lord. Oh, I beg you, find some way to rescue and deliver him from himself, as you delivered me." He made no answer for a little while, only looked at her very kindly and with a look of great contentment and happiness on his face. At last he spoke. "I am more than willing to do what you suggest," said he. "But, Grace and Glory, these unhappy souls we're speaking about will not allow me into their homes, nor even permit me to speak to them. I need a voice to speak for me, to persuade them to let me help them." "I see what you mean," she cried joyfully. "We will go down with you and speak to them, and show them what you have done for us, and what you are willing and able to do for them." Do you think they will listen to you? He asked, smiling at her very gently as he spoke. No, I don't think it's likely at all. At least, not at first, she answered. I was not at all the sort of person to make them want to listen to me. I did not behave at all lovingly to them. But you will tell me what to say. You will teach me, and I will say it for you. Oh, my lord, let us make haste and go down there. When they see what you have done for me, when they see peace and joy, I don't think in the end they will want you to help them too. I do think in the end they will want you to help them too. It is because they have lied to themselves about you and have persuaded themselves that you cannot do them good that they resist you and turn from your help. But we will plead with them, especially now, my lord, when they are so unhappy and so despised by others. Their very misery and loneliness and sorrow will make them more willing to listen to news of your grace and of your desire to help them. True, he agreed. This is just what I think. This is indeed a specially favorable time for us to go down and try to help them. He rose to his feet as he spoke. She sprang up too, and all four stood joyful and radiant on the edge of the high places, ready to go leaping down to the valley again. Then Grace and Glory saw that the great waterfall quite close at hand was leaping down to the valley too, with the tumultuous, joyful noise of many waters singing as they poured themselves down over the rock lip. From the heights we leap and flow to the valleys down below. Sweetest dirge and sweetest will to go lower, lower still. Suddenly she understood. She was beholding a wondrous and glorious truth. A great multitude whom no man could number, brought like herself by the King to the kingdom of love and to the high places so they could now pour out their lives in gladdest abandonment, leaped down with him to the sorrowful, desolate places below, to share with others the life which they had received. She was herself only one drop among that glad, exultant throng of self-givers, the followers of the King of Love, united with him and with one another, each one equally blessed and beloved as herself. For he loves each one of us, she said to herself, as though there were only one to love. The thought of being made one with the great fall of many waters filled her heart with ecstasy and with rapturous joy beyond the power to express. She too at last was to go down with them, pouring herself forth in love's abandonment of self-giving. He brought me to the heights just for this, she whispered to herself, and then looked at him and nodded. At that she began At that he began leaping and springing down the mountainside before them, bounding from rock to rock, always choosing, however, leaps which were within their power to follow, and sure footholds for less experienced feet. Behind him went Grace and Glory, with joy and peace beside her, leaping down just as the waters leaped and sang beside them. They mingled their voices with the joyful music of the many waters, singing their own individual song. Make haste, beloved, be thou like in heart on the mountains spicy sweet, and I on those high places where thou art will follow on Hinds' feet. As close behind the heart there leap the roe, so where thou goest, I will also go. That, as perhaps you know, is the last verse of the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. But for Grace and Glory, it was the beginning of a new song altogether. And so ends Hinds' feet on high places. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.